The rain came down in cold, whipping jets. The autumn wind lifted the flaps of her old coat, but Ruby still stood and looked at the huge hospital building, which was hiding her father behind its many windows. The 5-year-old girl was absolutely freezing, but did not leave her post, hoping that her father would see her and come out to his unhappy daughter. Not long ago, just 3 months ago, they came here with him to check on her mother. She was lying in a large white room, staring at them with a strange, unblinking look. Ruby's heart clenched with pity for her, but she could not fully realize that this was actually the same mother who used to read her bedtime stories, take her to the zoo, love to sing, and bake the most delicious pies in the world. During such visits, Daddy would sit Ruby on a chair, and he would sit down next to Megan, hold her hand, and tell her something at length, stroking her waveless hand. Ruby also remembered how terribly her mother screamed when she was still at home. She pleaded with her father to give her medicine, but he was adamant and asked to be patient, because not even half an hour after she had taken the strongest dose. Ruby did not understand anything and became afraid of her mother, tried not to enter the room where she was lying, and constantly asked her father why her mother was shouting. "Ruby, my dear, Mummy is very, very sick, and I can't help her in any way. But soon he will take her to the hospital, where she will be under care, and she will get better." Paul hugged his little daughter and buried himself in her soft curls, crying softly and silently. Then the mother was really put in the clinic, and the house became quiet, and that makes it even more uncomfortable. In general, Paul tried as rarely as possible to take Ruby with him to Megan, leaving her at his neighbour Mrs. Staub on weekends, or taking her to kindergarten on weekdays, but sometimes, guessing his wife's last wish, he brought Ruby to the ward and saw Megan's silent gratitude. And then Mrs. Staub took Ruby away for a whole week. The girl was given many activities, but she quickly got bored with drawing, sculpting, and looking at pictures in books, and Ruby managed to get out of her neighbour's apartment. She quietly went to her floor and saw that their apartment was crowded with strangers. Ruby could hardly squeeze between them and saw that everyone was crying and saying something in a dull voice. And then she saw her mother and sobbing father and screamed. Immediately Mrs. Staub picked her up and carried her to her apartment. A few days, the good woman did not leave the girl, who was down with a high fever, treated her, took care of her, told tales, and assiduously took Ruby away from the tragic memories. One evening, waiting for the girl to fall asleep, Mrs. Staub went to see Paul. "Why? Are you out of your mind?" she yelled, and then she took the rope out of his hands and slapped him on the cheeks, bringing him to his senses. "Pull yourself together. You're a man. Do you want your daughter to be raised by other people? Think about Ruby." But for Paul, the last 6 months have been so hard that he could not stand it, broke down, dropped his hands, and lost all the threads of life, really forgetting about his young daughter. So he ended up in the hospital with a nervous breakdown. The next day, Ruby was going home, but Mrs. Staub stopped her. "Daddy is in the hospital," she said. "He will get better in a few days, and I will definitely take you to him. And while I go to work, you can stay with my mother, okay?" The girl nodded. But as soon as the door closed behind Mrs. Staub, she peeked in at the elderly woman, made sure she was asleep, and ran toward the hospital, wearing only her thin coat. Rain whipped her pale face, autumn wind fluttered her hair, and Ruby was standing and waiting for her father. Olivia, a senior nurse, and aghast when she saw a lonely figure of the girl, and ran outside. "Oh, who are you? And where are your parents? And why are you standing there?" "I'm Ruby Cullen, and there's my dad at the hospital. First there was my mum, and then my dad." The woman took the girl by the hand and led her inside to figure it out. Olivia herself had no children and no husband. It had been 5 years since he left her for his young mistress, and already had a little boy. And Olivia brought home a stray kitten and took care of it. Of course, she had dated men for a while, but there was no one with whom she wanted to build a family relationship. Realizing that time to become a mother was irrevocably running out, the woman thought about adoption, but her unmarried status prevented her from dreaming about it. So Olivia resigned herself, calmed down, and accepted the situation for what it was. Nevertheless, she almost stopped meeting with her family friends and hurriedly passed by the playgrounds, trying not to listen to the merry hubbub coming from there. And now, seeing a girl soaking wet in the rain, Olivia rushed to the aid of a child. Very soon, the woman found out who her father was and came to the ward, told him off so hard that the other patients, fearing that they too would get, made their way to the corridor. The girl, meanwhile, sat in the nurse's room, eating pies and waiting to be called to her father. When Olivia took her to him, Ruby was happy to realize that he was not as sick as her mother, and another day later, Paul was discharged, and he started to get used to this life, taking antidepressants. Meanwhile, Olivia decided to try one last time to arrange her personal life and accepted her colleague's wooing. David had been married twice, but both marriages ended in divorce, and he lacked the usual female care. Olivia, who was innately a caring and kind woman, was quite a convenient option for him, and David, who had long sought her affection, was unspeakably happy that she gave in to his courtship. 3 months passed. One Sunday, Olivia finished all the household chores and just sat down to rest when she heard the doorbell. She opened the door and was surprised to see Paul and Ruby on the threshold. Olivia could hardly recognize this attractive man as the one who had been admitted to the hospital with a nervous breakdown. If it hadn't been for Ruby, she certainly wouldn't have recognized him. "Come in." Olivia opened the door hospitably. "We came by to say thank you, Olivia. If you hadn't shaken me up then, I don't know what would have happened. And this is for you." Paul handed Olivia flowers, and Ruby handed her something wrapped in paper. It turned out to be a photo frame. "I chose it myself," bragged the girl. Soon they were drinking tea, and Olivia treated her guests to freshly baked cupcakes. It had been a long time since she had had such a pleasant time. David, who came back from his shift and heard Olivia's gushing laughter, even stopped in the hallway, unable to understand what was going on. For these months, he had begun to think that Olivia was made of stone and could only smile ironically. He stepped into the kitchen and saw Paul. His sense of ownership was instantly awakened in him, and he left for the bedroom, muttering a greeting grudgingly. Olivia apologized and hurried after him, noticing how embarrassed Paul was. "You and I are getting married in a week," came the voice of David, who had not thought to behave more modestly. "Or you found yourself a new family? Well then, I'll pack my things right now." Olivia quietly answered him something, but he did not want to calm down. When Olivia finally persuaded him to go out to the guests, it turned out that they were gone. Cups of unfinished tea were getting cold on the table. That was the last straw, and Olivia turned to David. "You wanted to pack your things, didn't you? Then I can help you. I just now realized that I don't love you, and I don't want to live with you." "Oh, Olivia dear, I was just kidding." David tried to calm her down. "But I am not," replied Olivia in all seriousness. David got furious and started threatening her. "Do you think you can do this to me?" "No, darling, it won't be your way. Have you forgotten that the head doctor is my cousin? Do you want to get fired from your job? I'll arrange it for you." David left slamming the door, but in the evening he was back again, asked forgiveness, swore his love, and again left to no avail. For several days, Olivia tried to break off the abusive relationship, and finally she was asked to write a letter of resignation. That same evening, Olivia went to Paul's house and rang the doorbell for a long time, but no one opened it for her. And then a woman looked out of the apartment next door and said that Paul and Ruby had gone away for good. 3 months passed. One day, Olivia got a call from her elderly aunt and asked her to visit. Olivia was almost nothing, keeping her in the city except part-time jobs, and in the village where her aunt lived, she could get a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. The aunt was pleased about her niece's decision, and when she arrived, she welcomed her with open arms. The elderly woman was feeling, just bored, but Olivia resolutely took charge of her health and the order of the house. "Auntie, your yard is very weedy. How do you deal with it?" "Dear, ask the neighbour. He's a good man. He will mow it all up in an hour." Olivia went over to the old wooden fence and called out to the owners. The door of the house swung open, and Olivia was dumbfounded. Paul appeared on the threshold, and from under his arm looked out the nose of a smiling Ruby. 3 years had passed. Olivia and Paul had long lived as a family in a large new house and were happy. Paul took up farming. Olivia got a job at the local nurses' station, although she had to go on maternity leave during her pregnancy. Ruby went to school and was an excellent student. Olivia's aunt lived with them and was very pleased with such a big happy family, and in the photo frame that Ruby once gave to Olivia, there was a picture of her standing with her daddy and Olivia and holding her newborn baby brother.